we're going to be talking about frameworks and standards and guidelines. Why do I want to bring this up? Because it's really a topic that's near and dear to my heart. The fact of the matter is I've worked for companies that say they focus on one framework or one standard. And the reality is that's really not the case, or shouldn't be the case, because you're short selling your organization if you focus on the wrong level of framework. So for those of you who are in a time crunch, this is the one slide to remember. So this, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but basically at every level of the organization, there are different frameworks and standards that you should be looking at to implement. From a risk tolerance or the board level perspective, right? It's about capability maturity or cybersecurity maturity models. That's really talking about what your security posture is and how can you improve your security posture. When we get into the policy level, that's where NIST CSF comes into play, and ISO 27001, because ISO 27001 is the information security management policies or information systems management protocol. Then at the controls level, that's where you go into like ISO 27002, SB 800-53, and some of the other coalesced control sets like the Secure Controls Framework or the Unified Compliance Framework. And then I like to talk about use cases. So under controls, a control itself by itself is not a good enough way of looking at your organization. You have to kind of break down each control into all the use cases that the control covers. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And that's where the MITRE ATT&CK framework comes in. And then your countermeasures is where MITRE DEFEND comes in. So there's a lot of different areas we need to talk about. So let me talk a little bit about the need for frameworks, right? Those of us who have been in security leadership position know that our reality is really squirrel-based management, right? We're trying to gather all the nuts and bury them or eat them. And, you know, we have all these different areas we need to look at simultaneously. We're interrupt driven. And so our plan is to try and kind of organize that down into something that's manageable, something we can delegate, something we can review and measure. And that comes down into cybersecurity management, cybersecurity ops, cybersecurity technology, outreach, and reporting. And I break that down into those big layers because each one of them has their own tasks involved with them. And, you know, if you look at these and you break it down this way, it becomes a much more manageable process. In fact, some of the largest organizations I've seen, the CISO doesn't manage these. The CISO has a deputy or a delegate for each one of these 5 pillars. And that's what makes that whole organization run efficiently when there's that many people. So when we get into the reporting end of things, right, how do we figure out what our security posture is? And in most cases, it's at a high level. We're looking at, well, what's our maturity, right? So we need a maturity model. And then we have to understand how we can measure that maturity model against some of our controls and policies. And that's where framework and standards come in. And then we have to assess that we have to apply metrics or valuations to things that might be intangible. And from there, we can get our security posture. And all of these things require 4 different steps, right? Each one of these needs a scoping process. It needs to actually be assessed in itself. Is it valid? Is it a valid measurement? And then we have to figure out where the gaps are between what our target state and where we are today. And then how do we report it? So it's important to understand these factors. I'm just going to take a quick sidebar on reporting. A lot of us know about the SOC 2 Type 2 reports. But a lot of times when we deal with vendors, we usually get a SOC 1 or a SOC 3. And what's the difference between these SOC reports? Well, SOC 1 is really a focus on the governance and procedures. That means that do you have a security program in place and are you following that security program? It doesn't necessarily say your security program is good. It's just saying, do you have a documented security program? That's where ISO 27001 comes in. So for those in manufacturing, ISO 9001 would be the manufacturing equivalent of that. So it's really about oversight and proper documentation. It's not about the effectiveness. SOC 2 is actually about the effectiveness, saying, are we doing everything our program says we're doing? And is it appropriate for our level of security or our level of business? And so that's where ISO 27002 or in manufacturing, ISO 9002 comes in. And it's about really, are you doing vendor management? Are you doing all the, do you have all the vulnerabilities and gaps identified? And are you managing them? SOC 3 you think would be the next step down, but actually it's the next step up. So SOC 3 is a simple one-page letter of assurance that somebody's done a SOC 1 or a SOC 2 examination. A lot of times vendors will give me a SOC 3 report. It's a single page. It's signed by E&Y or one of the other big firms, but it doesn't tell me any detail about what your organization does and how effective your organization is at managing security. So again, little sidebar, but it's really important to know when you're dealing with vendors and they're trying to, they say, oh, we follow ISO 9000, ISO 27003, 27001. So what are maturity models, frameworks, and standards come into play about this? Well, let's talk about maturity models real quick. So there's a lot of maturity models, and each one has their own focus. And you probably know about CMMI, or from the government perspective, the CMMC, which is the Capability Maturity Model Certification. And that's kind of more of a universal, generic thing. And a lot of companies do follow CMMI because it is very generic and can apply to a lot of different areas. But there are other different ones out there. Just kind of know that, because there's a different, and I'll talk a little bit about the newest one that came out, the C2M2, the Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, which was developed by the Department of Energy. And that really focuses on people, processes, and technologies. So again, CMM is the baseline, or is the golden standard, but there's other ones out there. So find one that's appropriate for your business. A thing about security maturity, folks will do a security assessment and say, hey, we're at level 3, which is, managed. And, we want to get up to that next level. Well, there's a couple of different aspects here. Number one, to move from stage 1, which is ad hoc, to stage 2, which is reported. It's probably a significant change in how you do things, but to go from reported to managed is even a bigger jump. And as you move up that security model, every single step gets exponentially harder to do. So you have to make sure you do some planning and make sure you have that a good project plan set out on how you're going to reach that next level of maturity. The other thing I'd like to bring up is that not all aspects of your security program will reach the same level of maturity. And I'll get into that a little bit later. I talked a little bit about CMMC and C2M2. CMMC talks about those 5 stages that we all know and love, ad hoc, developing, defined or reported, maintained, and optimizing. C2M2 kind of deals a little bit differently, right? So they have the ad hoc and documented, which is the same as initial and defined, but managed is a little bit more nuanced than maintained, and policy is kind of, again, going back to the fact that, are we following our risk tolerance? Do we have policies around it? And we're tying that back to our pyramid, or Tower of Babel. Now, what about frameworks and standards? Ton out there. In fact, I don't think I mentioned all of them here. I think TOGAF, the OASIS TOGAF is missing, and COBIT is missing, but there's a ton out there. The NIST is great because it's a standard that the federal government uses, and I like it because it actually does list specific controls or specific means of controls that you can apply. Then this cybersecurity framework is a little bit higher level, kind of defines the areas that you need to control. So again, a lot of good stuff out here. If you're in the consumer business or take credit cards, PCI DSS, I think they're at version 4 now, is one of those things that you have to do. So again, if each one of these has a different focus, pick the one that's appropriate for your organization at the appropriate level. Kathy Braun earlier today talked a little bit about MITRE ATT&CK, and the MITRE ATT&CK framework is interesting. Again, these are frameworks, but these frameworks have a little bit different type of focus. And I want to talk about indicators of compromise, what we call IOCs, which basically are bits of information that we can search for to see if we've been compromised, and TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, which are basically the methods that threat actors use to attack us. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a great reference model for IOCs and TTPs, and I'm going to make this a little distinction later. These are offensive measures. These are measures that are being used to attack against us. Defend is a defensive measure. These are counter tactics that we can take. So if we're looking to map our security program to MITRE ATT&CK, might be too much to chew on. The MITRE Defend framework, which is still in beta, is to me a better way to go, because, and we'll get into this in a little bit about the interrelationships between these two. And those aren't the only two out there. Varus, which is basically used for the Verizon's DBIR, is basically a dictionary of TTPs. Styx is used by a lot of financial firms, Styx and Taxi, which is basically standardizes a lot of the MITRE ATT&CK and financial firm operations for threat actors. So let's talk about how these frameworks work together. And again, I think Kathy Braun had brought this out, as well as Mary. CSF, MITRE ATT&CK, and MITRE Defend are all different sides of the same coin. This CSF is great because it categorizes. You have those 5 broad categories, and you can now go into each one of them and say, well, do my controls manage these type of issues? MITRE ATT&CK, again, I talked about, was an offensive model. It's a list of IOCs and TTPs, and Defend is, again, a defensive model saying what are the known ways to do countermeasures against those type of attacks. All of these things are different languages, and they have sort of different purposes. But one thing I like about MITRE ATT&CK and Defend is that MITRE is actually building what they call a digital artifact ontology that relates the two. So they take the offensive model and they take the defensive model, and they show all the ways that a defensive model can manage offensive attacks. So if you think about this, your defense browser isolation not only does URL protection, but can protect emails that have bad URLs, or documents that could be loaded through a URL, or file shares that are accessed through web browsers. So there's a lot of different things that you can get into. I like this simplified diagram, but if you go into MITRE itself, it's a little more difficult to read. And so you'll see that they'll give you some countermeasure techniques and related offensive techniques. It doesn't really make much sense unless you look at that previous ontology and say, yeah, I get it. This is the way it should be. And then you map it, and you can say, okay, this is what I want to do. Where I work today, they actually did an analysis of that relationship between attack and defend frameworks against some of their products that they provide. And I took out the names, but the types are secure email gateway, browser isolation, and security awareness training. And they actually mapped it to some mitigations, to the offensive model, to the defensive model. And there's a lot of these simple things are become more complex. So trying to map out the relationships between attack and defend with actual tools that are out there, or with actual use cases that are out there, becomes a really tough exercise. I think as the defend framework gets out of beta and gets more mature, the ontology and the tools available to do that mapping for you will mature as well. And I foresee MITRE actually providing these tool sets where you can actually just import your vendor products and maybe your risk register, and be able to start mapping this out. And that kind of gets me down to the frameworks and assessment methodologies. So when we're starting to see about how are we assessing our controls and our countermeasures against certain frameworks or against certain attacks, we need to assess them. And the way we assess them is really, and again, this is pretty well known, people, process, technology, and we try and overlay that with governance, risk, and compliance. And so I know I've seen some presentations where GRC is done as a fourth pillar, but I see GRC as overriding all of these to make sure things are being done well, right? That we're managing our capabilities and portfolios, that we're aligning this to our enterprise risk management or our risk registers, or aligning this to our security maturity model. So again, when we start assessing, we have to always kind of look back or look up and look down to make sure that we're doing everything from a people process technology downwards and a maturity model upwards. So let's move on. Let's see. So if we get into NIST CSF, right? And those assessment functions, again, NIST CSF has some really great area, those 5 pillars. And if we're looking at people, process, and technology, we can map between the two. So it's not that difficult to do the mapping at a high level. But then when we start getting into our own controls and policies and mapping them into this method, it becomes pretty difficult. I also want to introduce a little extension of NIST CSF. This is done by a person, Sunil Yu, who I used to work for at Bank of America. He came up with the cyber defense matrix, and it basically takes your asset classes across the NIST cybersecurity framework, and also talks about the degrees of dependency on people, technology, and process. Now, why is this important? Well, it's almost a 3-dimensional array of allowing you to manage your security posture. In this example, right, we could talk about all the different security solutions that we were paying for and where they fit into these into this model. And if visually, we can see right away that our respond and recover is really not doing not very robust. And if we actually did an industry mapping, the industry mapping shows the same, that a lot of vendors, security vendors, are focused on identify and protect and detect, but not a lot are on respond and recover. And again, I don't have an answer as to why we don't have more, especially with ransomware. To me, ransomware, to take a little sidebar, ransomware is broken into payload and delivery. And like Mary said, that if you're going to do pen testing against the delivery, the payload already being installed, right? So that would, to me, fall under respond and recover. And again, if you're assuming that you've already been hacked, there should be more in that area. And again, when we're doing our own assessment, right, we want to start taking a look at that previous chart of where we have solutions in place, and then start applying some metrics to this. And again, what Sunil has done here, and it's not my work, this is Sunil's work. He talks about, well, what are the people resources? What are the maintenance costs? What are the configuration costs? And what is our ability to actually use these tools? Sometimes we have so many tools, we don't have the ability to use them effectively. So this is again, if Sunil actually has a book on this, the Cyber Defense Matrix, which discusses a lot of this in detail. I'm just, again, trying to go over it very quickly. Again, with the Cyber Defense Matrix, once we've mapped out what we've spent in resources, in maintenance fees, and licensing, in actual usability, we'll start seeing where we're spending money and where we need to spend more money. Again, respond and recover, we see multiple security gaps in this example. And maybe we're overspending in protect and detect. Maybe that's the organizational risk tolerance. They want to spend that much on protect and detect because, again, they may have a brand reputation issue that they want to prevent. So that's really again an exercise that you should try. So let's talk about mapping the organizational risks frameworks. And again, I told you this is actually my Tower of Babel, I call it. I actually have a printed copy right on my wall, because when I talk to clients, this is what I talk about. I talk about, okay, what frameworks are you using? And they'll give me one framework. I'm like, that's the only one you're using? I'll show them this, and then the light bulb will go on. But here, again, in this particular example, I did say one item for risk tolerance, how it breaks down to different policies, how one policy breaks down to different controls, and how one control breaks down to different use cases, and how each use case may have one or more countermeasures or solutions that we apply to them. This is pretty arduous to do. In fact, a lot of times organizations will do bottom up. They'll say, oh, what solutions do we have? And what do those solutions cover? And so we say, oh, we have CASB and we have a firewall, and we have a DLP program that prevents our data leakage. And that helps with our user activity and minimizing information loss. But does that cover all the use cases? We don't know. So it's very it's very easy to go from bottom up because we already have we're doing a spend on security, and the CFO wants to know why we're spending so much on CASB and firewall, and we do that bottom up analysis. But I'd say that we're missing a bunch of gaps when we do that bottom up analysis. In fact, if we do the top down analysis on that same control, we'll find that there's a lot of use cases, and that each use case may have things that we already handle, like removable media. We could easily install, create a GPO, a group policy, to stop removable media. Or we have a VPN to prevent access to file share sites. Those kind of give us a better analysis, but it also tells us what we're missing. It tells us where the gaps are. What about transferring data to an insecure zone? And an insecure zone could be defined by the organization as out of department, or through email, or from some other mechanism. What about manual cut and paste? What about the application vulnerabilities themselves? Like Mary said, some of these applications, the basic security hygiene isn't being done. Are we covering all this? So the top-down mapping gives us a better idea of where we stand with our security posture. And it's okay to have some blank areas, but you need to be able to identify them and then communicate them for your risk register. We take a different approach, right? And we start trying to map everything to NIST CSF. I think I mentioned this before. It's great, but it becomes very arduous because each one of these controls is so high level that you have a lot of countermeasures and a lot of solutions, and a lot of solutions will actually double up, be in multiple places. So you don't really have a good idea of what your actual countermeasure controls are, or your coverage is, because these are so high level. So saying, well, if it's too high level, let's go down to MITRE ATT&CK. And again, MITRE ATT&CK gives you actually the capability to upload your products mappings as a JSON to their tool, and then you can start managing the attack framework with your tools. But again, I view a tool mapped against an IOC or TTP isn't really a good mapping. It's all we have out here, unfortunately, in this current time. It's good, but it's not great. And what happens is there'll be a lot of gaps because, again, there's going to be a lot of overlap between tools, and some tools fit into a gray area. You may not understand where all the different areas of IOCs that it might cover. If we, again, I look forward to MITRE Defend getting out of beta because I think this becomes a better mapping of our security tools to the MITRE Defend framework, because that becomes more robust, and we can actually see from MITRE Defend all the different IOCs and TTPs that we're covering, and we can validate that against our tools, saying our tool set does, if our tool set does browser isolation, is it covering all the aspects of browser isolation in the TTP? So that to me becomes a much more useful mapping. So again, I'm looking forward for this coming out of beta. If I don't think attack is totally useless. Actually, I think it's very useful. And where I find it useful is when we look at our analysis over time. We could start mapping the analysis of vulnerabilities that we've seen, and attacks that we've stopped, that we've prevented, and start mapping them to some of the MITRE ATT&CK frameworks. And this becomes a great reporting tool, both downward, because we're saying, oh, how effective are we doing? Do we have to change our operational model to adjust for the different TTPs that are coming out? And upward to say that, listen, we're seeing a spike in this TTP, which is done by this threat actor, and we need more resources to basically buy either a new tool or buy more headcount or buy more resources to manage that particular trend. So attack does make sense, but you have to have a context around it. Again, if we were mapping the risks that we have to the cyber defense matrix, we would here map our particular strategies. And with this, we would actually see, okay, where are our gaps? What are we doing in each one of these areas? And again, it's not full coverage. It's probably piecemeal, but it allows us to, again, get a quick overview of where we are today. I talked a little bit about mapping our tools to the maturity model. And this is a very nuanced point. You can't get every tool up to level 4 or optimizing level. And I'll give you a good example. Passwords, right? Authentication may get up into optimizing model because you may go to passwordless or MFA or some new thing that's coming out there like sharding. But passwords in themselves or password management in themselves may not get past the defined stage. So you have to understand your security tooling and your controls and say, what's the maximum maturity that control can reach, and put a line in the sand there saying, yes, we've reached the maximum that we can do with password management. So you can go to the organization and say, well, we've reached the max of password management and what we can do with it. If we want to mature to the next level, we have to think bigger. We have to think outside the box, or we have to think about authentication or authorization in a different way. So again, mapping your tooling to maturity model is actually a good thing, but understand that know what the limits are of each of the tools or each of the strategies that you use. And I know I'm running a little fast here. I'll talk about some key takeaways, and then I'll open it up for questions. So number one, your company should not rely on a single framework, right? You should build frameworks around each layer of security mapping that you have, from risk tolerance to policies to controls to use cases to countermeasures. There's a different framework for each one of those. You don't have to pick a framework for every one of those, but understand that when you talk about frameworks, what are you covering? If you're only going to do CMM and NIST CSF, you may be missing out on a standardization of the lower level areas that might need better management. If you're only doing NIST SB 800-53 and maybe not the MITRE DEFEND, you might be just hitting the control layer and not understanding that the countermeasures that you need to get to that control layer. So again, understand the correct use and scope for each framework. I am a big fan of working top down. It's much harder to do top down threat modeling or top down analysis than it is to do bottom up, because it's bottom up is so much easier to do and so much quicker to do, but you will understand the gaps you have when you start looking top down and start expanding. From a security assessment model, make sure you build a security assessment that is industry accepted, so you have consistency, and that it's defendable, that we're not using new math, we're using tried and true valuations of intangible aspects. That's basically, how do you do impact analysis? The FAIR model is one of those good ways of doing impact analysis. And again, it may not be absolutely correct, but it's close enough. And again, consistency. If you use the FAIR model month over month, quarter over quarter, year over year, it becomes defensible because now you have a baseline to work from. And make sure your assessments are actionable. That means that they follow the business strategy and business tactics, that they follow the business idea of what risk acceptance and risk tolerance is. So I'm sorry, that's all I have. That was a lot to take in. So I'll open it up for questions. Do you have any questions? I'm sorry, I haven't seen the chat, and I'll open up the chat now. Ken, what is the best approach? I'll let Ken ask this live. Let me get to this. Okay, Ken.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I'm just trying to get a lot of material here. You did cover a lot of field around this topic, which I think is really important. I think one of the challenges I find, and I think organizations find generally, is what's the level of cadence? What's the process by which I can feel confident that I'm staying in front of all of this, meaning that I'm pretty much up to date on where I think my risks lie. How often do I need to reassess my maturity, my capabilities? Is it a continuous? Is it a cultural change that I have to just? Does it become like a a continuous improvement of the organization, just the way the organization operates, if you will. I'm just trying to get a sense of that. Is it a schedule? Is it a combination of things?
Actually, let me jump to a slide here. If I can, I don't know if I can jump to the slides here. I'll go back to the very first model I had. And again, this is the one that this is the one, oh, did I go in? No. So this is the one I push all the time. This model, right? This pyramid model. And to me, the cadence goes with the layer. So how often should you be looking at your maturity model or changing your maturity model? Not often. You should actually do a good, and whatever one you pick, it's not going to be wrong. It's just going to be the way you present things to the board. So picking a maturity model, you probably do it once. Picking a policy model, again, it's probably, if you're revamping the entire security program, like if you're going to zero trust, maybe it's time to get rid of ISO 27001 and go to NIST CSF. You may want to try and, again, think about those major infrastructure changes and do it then. So they're kind of event driven. Controls, I would say you probably wouldn't, you'd probably always look at the controls at least once annually. In fact, I think there is a standard that says you should be reviewing all policies and controls at least once annually. But with the controls aspect of it, new threats come out all the time. So looking at the controls that are there help you understand, is this threat applicable to our business? And if it is it something that we should be doing in our daily basis, right? Is a control we should add? And we every year at a bank I used to work at, we used to say start, stop, continue. What policy, what controls do we start? We need to add. What policies are outdated, and what policies do we need to review and just continue doing? And then when you get into the use cases change with every product release, with every feature, with every new customer or product offering you have to look at those use cases. And in fact, if you were doing a threat modeling exercise, maybe you have teams that just look at one policy and do a threat model down that policy. I was on a bunch of policy teams at that bank, and once a year we were assigned a policy and to dive all the way down to those use cases to see if we're covering them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's a combination, I guess, of good hygiene of selecting the right things across risk tolerance policies and controls and what have you. But there's a little bit of continuous improvement at the same time embedded within this as it relates to controls evolve over time, implementation changes over time, new controls come to play, policies are updated on a regular cadence. Risk tolerance, that could, I guess it could change or evolve over time with the organization, and ultimately use cases when it comes to, different things that you could potentially use these controls for, et cetera.
And actually, you bring up a real good point about risk tolerance. So risk tolerance will change over time when board members change or when the business direction changes. That doesn't mean you change your framework. You just basically need to recalculate your framework. And there's this idea of what we call a breadbasket. So if we're doing a security maturity model and we're reporting it up, and all of a sudden we want to change the breadbasket to include a new area of business that we've entered into, I would actually go back and recalculate the last 6 months of reporting, assuming that element was in the breadbasket. So then when I go to the board, I would say, okay, here's our maturity today. But if we changed our breadbasket, and if we were tracking this new element for the past 6 months, this is where we would be right now. So that way you give them context. You're not just throwing something new at them, and you're giving them a background. You want to try and be able to answer the questions before they ask them.
No, that sounds like it makes sense, because especially in the risk tolerance, and you're going to reassess that. Potentially, you could have things that are falling out of bed and now are out of tolerance for the organization as a result of that reassessment.
Yeah. It's not easy. I mean, that's the one thing I like to stress, is that all this theory is great, but actually in practicality, it takes a lot of resources, or it takes the right resources. It's not something you just throw over to the business owner and say, hey, I need you to give me your threat model on your controls for your application, right?
Thanks.
No, thank you.